The silence in Pelican Bay's SHU was so complete that some men said they could hear their own heartbeat arguing with their sanity. If stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe, because this one only gets darker. On the morning the hunger strike began, the tier felt colder than usual, the kind of cold that lived inside the concrete rather than the air. Guards moved with a rehearsed indifference, sliding meal trays through metal ports that nobody touched. Inside those windowless cells, men who hadn't seen the sun in years were making the only protest left available to them, starving themselves to be heard. One of them was a man everyone simply called Rivas. He'd been in the SHU for 13 years. Not because he stabbed someone. Not because he threatened a guard. But because a sergeant claimed a faded Aztec drawing in his notebook was gang symbolism. That accusation alone, just a sketch, locked him into indefinite solitary confinement. No court hearing. No evidence beyond interpretation. Just validation. Rivas had filed appeals, written letters, tried every administrative maze the prison offered. Every door led back to the same concrete box. The only way out, officers kept reminding him, was to debrief, to give names, real or not. The message was simple: talk and walk, or stay silent and rot. As day one of the strike unfolded, a low unease passed up the tier. Word traveled through vent grates and taps on pipes. Inmates who hadn't spoken to another human in months now shared a single goal: expose the system that kept them buried alive. By mid-afternoon, medical staff were already making rounds. Pressure cuffs. Clipboard notes. Hollow stares. Some guards mocked the protest, others looked uneasy, as if they knew the cracks in the SHU's foundations were finally showing. But what rattled Rivas most was what happened when a young guard paused at his door. The officer slipped a folded memo through the slot, no explanation, no expression. Just a whisper: "You didn't get this from me." Rivas unfolded it with trembling hands. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was something far more dangerous, evidence that the validation system wasn't just flawed, it was being manipulated from inside. Before he could read the rest, alarms blared down the corridor, red lights washing over steel and shadows. Something had gone wrong, terribly wrong, in another wing of the SHU. And as the noise swallowed the silence, one truth settled over him like a weight: someone knew the hunger strike wasn't just a protest. Someone feared what it might expose. The alarms died out, but the tension they summoned stayed behind like a ghost in the concrete. Hours later, the memo still lay on Rivas's lap, its creases softening with each reread. It was a roster, names of inmates who had been validated with no discernible pattern. Some had no gang ties at all. Some were placed on the list the same week they filed grievances. A few had simply spoken out about conditions. What struck him hardest was the column labeled source. Almost every entry said the same thing: confidential informant number 73. If stories like this hit you hard, subscribe, because what comes next is where the truth begins to twist. On the tier, other inmates didn't know about the memo, but they felt the pressure rising. Hunger was settling in. Some were lightheaded, others nauseous, and a few already had that distant, glassy look in their eyes. But no one broke. Not yet. Down the corridor, Martinez, a man who once ran yards with the Nuestra Familia before age and isolation carved the fight out of him, spoke through the vent to Rivas in a rasp. "They're scared," he whispered. "This place only works if we stay quiet. We stop eating long enough, someone up top loses their sleep." Another voice chimed in from a cell 2 doors down, tapping code through the wall. "They'll offer deals soon. Transfers. Privileges. Maybe even kick someone out of SHU just to break us apart." And they were right. By the next morning, officers arrived with clipboards, feigning concern. "Think about your health. Think about your family. We can review your validation if you cooperate." Each sentence was a velvet-wrapped threat. But the real shift came when the warden's office sent investigators onto the tier. Not medical staff. Not counselors. Gang unit investigators. They lingered outside doors, taking notes, staring at inmates as if cataloging them for something new. When one stopped at Rivas's cell, he didn't bother with small talk. "You're making a mistake," the investigator said. "This protest won't change the system. It'll just make life harder for you." Rivas didn't answer. Silence was the only power he had left. The investigator leaned a little closer to the metal slot. "Funny thing," he murmured. "Somebody's been circulating paperwork. Something they shouldn't have. If it turns up in your hands, that's a validation all over again." Before Rivas could react, the man walked away, boots echoing down the empty corridor. A threat disguised as a warning. A warning disguised as a message. But it confirmed the truth: the memo was real. And someone inside the prison wanted it buried. That night, the hunger strike reached a breaking point. One inmate collapsed, triggering a chain of shouts and frantic banging on doors. Guards rushed in, but not with sympathy, more like annoyance at an inconvenience. As they wheeled the unconscious man out on a stretcher, a folded slip of paper fell from his jumpsuit pocket. Rivas recognized the handwriting instantly. It was the same handwriting from the memo. And the last line on the note changed everything he thought he understood about the validation system. #73 wasn't an inmate. Number 73 was staff. The revelation hit Rivas harder than hunger ever could. The prison's most prolific informant wasn't a man trapped behind a steel door. It was someone wearing a badge. Someone who moved freely through corridors where inmates were forbidden to speak, breathe, or dream without permission. By dawn, the tier had fallen into a heavy stillness, a mix of dehydration, exhaustion, and a growing belief that the walls around them were hiding something far bigger than solitary confinement. The strike had started as a protest. Now it felt like an investigation unfolding in slow motion, led by men who hadn't walked outside in years. Medical teams made rounds again, this time with a sense of urgency. One inmate's kidneys were beginning to fail. Another couldn't stand. A third rambled nonsensically, caught between delirium and hallucination. But even as bodies weakened, resolve hardened. Something was finally unraveling. Word spread through vents and pipes. If staff were behind the false validations, then the SHU wasn't a security measure. It was a containment system, designed to bury anyone who threatened the institution's narrative. Later that afternoon, investigators returned. This time, they went cell to cell with a new tone, stern, clipped, rehearsed. "You end the strike today," one said. "This protest is over." But the inmates didn't respond. Their silence was louder than any riot. When the team reached Rivas, the lead investigator stared at him for a long moment, as if assessing how much he truly knew. "You're not dying for a cause," the man said quietly. "You're dying for a misunderstanding." Rivas met his gaze through the narrow food slot. "If it's a misunderstanding," he whispered, then opened the records. For the first time in 13 years, the investigator had no comeback. Hours passed. The tier sank back into a hollow quiet, interrupted only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant thud of a door slamming somewhere in the labyrinth above. And then, unexpectedly, the sound of keys approached. A sergeant stopped at Rivas's door. "Pack your things," he said. Rivas didn't move. "Why?" "You're being reviewed," the sergeant replied. "All of you are. Not released. Not exonerated. Reviewed." But in Pelican Bay, even that small shift felt like a crack of sunlight forcing its way into the darkest corner of the prison system. The strike had done something the courts, the lawsuits, and the appeals never could. It forced the institution to look at itself. As guards escorted the weakened inmates out one by one for evaluations, some stumbled, some leaned on the wall for support, and some looked up for the first time in years, seeing nothing but a fluorescent ceiling, yet feeling hope anyway. For Rivas, stepping out of his cell felt surreal. The hallway was the same gray tunnel it had always been, but something intangible had shifted in the air. He knew the battle wasn't won. He knew the system wouldn't crumble overnight. Yet for the first time since that Aztec drawing condemned him, he believed the truth might finally reach the outside world. Years later, testimonies from the hunger strike would help dismantle the validation process and expose the dangerous flaws that kept men locked away indefinitely. But in that moment, weak, hungry, and unsteady, none of the inmates were thinking about victory. They were thinking about survival, and about the humanity that had been denied to them for so long. Rivas looked back at the SHU door closing behind him and realized something simple, something devastating, something liberating. They hadn't starved themselves to escape a cell. They had starved themselves to be seen. If you think this story was intense, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.